Hello, this is Nathan with Nice at Dice. Today I'm taking a look at a game called Pandemic Iberia. I'm going to be showing you a little bit of how the game works and giving you my review of it. Now, you may be familiar with the popular cooperative game Pandemic, where you are traveling around the world, working together to fight the spread of disease. In Pandemic Iberia, you are playing basically the same game, but the setting has been changed to the Iberian Peninsula about the middle of the 1800s. So rather than being focused on curing diseases, at this point, people were just starting to research diseases and how they spread, and so you're trying to effectively research for diseases. Because of the limitations of technology, you can't travel as easily, and there are a few other things that are going on that are different in this game than in a regular game of Pandemic. But if you're not familiar with Pandemic, I'm going to explain how the game works and then give you my thoughts on it. So let's take a look at the game now. So what we have here is a game of Pandemic Iberia, about a couple of rounds in. So you can see we have a board in the center with a map of the Iberian Peninsula. Each of these little colored dots is a city. Each city is connected to other cities by these lines. You also have what they call the infection deck here, player deck here, and we have kind of simulated 3 different players' hands. So each player is going to have a roll card that gives you a specific character you're playing, and then a number of player cards, up to 7 in your hand at a time. The player cards are for the most part like this. You can see it has the name of a city on the board and a little map kind of giving you an idea where that city is on the board. And it is also has a color. The color on the card matches the color of the city on the board. And all of the cities on the board are divided into these 4 colors, which also represent the 4 different diseases down here that you're trying to research. So the object of the game is to work together cooperatively to effectively research all 4 of these diseases. How you do that is to have 5 cards in your hand of the same color, to be on a city with a hospital of that color. Hospitals are these little wooden structures. And then you use an action to discard 5 cards of that color to research the disease, and you put a little marker there to indicate that that disease has been researched. You want to do that with all 4 of the diseases, and then you've won the game. Now, apart from using an action to research a disease, you have 4 actions on your turn, and you're going to use them to do a variety of things. For example, you can simply move your pawn from the city that you're in to an adjacent city. That would be one action. Another action that you could take is to move by ship. So if, for example, like the white player over here in the corner, they're in a city that's on the coast, they could discard any card from their hand, such as this black card, to travel to any black city that's also along the coast, like perhaps to there. That's another action you can take. A third action you can take is to move by train. Now, before I explain moving by train, let me just show you a 4th action you can take. You can build a railroad piece, which are represented by these little cardboard tokens. So you can build it on a path going out of the city that you're in. So, for example, the yellow player could build one here. Now, the other action you can take is to move by train. When you move by train, you can move as far as you want along consecutive railroad pieces. So for example, for one action, you could move from this city all the way through here and stop in this city. So those are 4 of the basic actions you can do. A 5th action you can do is to simply remove one of these colored cubes from a city. The colored cubes represent the 4 diseases, and more specifically in this version of Pandemic, they represent a group of patients infected with that disease. So when you remove one of these cubes, you're just treating the disease in those patients, and so they are no longer infected. You can also purify water. So because of the setting of this game, a lot of the activities of the players is not so much about curing the diseases, but preventing the spread of disease. And one of the ways that you do that is by purifying water. So in order to explain that, it's important to understand that each of these spaces between cities is considered a region. So for example, this city, this city, this city, and that city, those 4 cities define this area in between them as a region. So for an action, you can discard a card matching the color of any city along the border of that region. So for example, the yellow player could discard this yellow card to add these purification tokens to an adjacent region. Now the purpose of those purification tokens is to prevent the spread of disease in the cities that border that region. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Another thing you can do is build a hospital. In order to build a hospital, you have to discard the card for the city where you are located at. So for example, if I was over here in Barcelona, I could discard this yellow card to build the yellow hospital at that location. And then of course you can research the disease, which I already explained. And then the last thing you can do is you can trade knowledge. So for example, if the yellow player and the black player were both in Barcelona and the yellow player had the card for Barcelona, he could give that to the black player. Now, of course, that means the black player would be over his hand limit. He would have to immediately discard a card so that he goes back down to 7 cards. But those are all the basic actions of the game. Now, after you've taken 4 actions, which could be any of those 4 actions I've just described, and you can do the same action multiple times if you like, then afterwards, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to move patients. So in this game, patients move towards the hospital that matches the color of the patient. So now we have a yellow hospital here. The nearest yellow patient would move to that hospital. We have a red hospital here. So the nearest red patient would move to that hospital, which would be this guy. This patient can move along the railroad tracks just like players can, so he will get there in 1 action. So railroads are a double-edged sword in that sense because they'll help you move across the board more quickly, but they'll also help patients move to the hospitals more quickly, which sounds like it would be a good thing, but hospitals can become overrun. Now after you've moved patients, you're going to draw 2 cards from the player deck and add those to your hand. And then you're going to draw cards from the infection deck. The number of cards you draw is based on this track here and where the marker is on the track. In the beginning of the game, it's just 2 cards. So we draw these 2 cards, and then we'll add more patients to those cities. So for example, at this point, we would add 1 patient of the black color to this city here. And we would add 1 patient of the blue color to that city there. And then those get discarded. Then it would be the next player's turn. Now there's a few things that can change things up here. One is, as you're going through the player deck, you're going to occasionally draw cards such as this one. This is an event card. Event cards go in your hand just like any other player card, but they do something special instead of being used the way the city cards are used. Another thing that's going to come up in the player deck is this card, an epidemic. There'll be a number of epidemics in the deck depending on the difficulty that you set the game at when you begin. It could be anywhere from 4 to 6. So when you draw an epidemic card, the first thing you have to do is move the infection rate up. So now the number of cards you're drawing from this deck at the end of each turn is going to be higher. Then you have to infect 1 city, and this city comes from the bottom of the infection deck. So we'll draw this card here, for example, and then we have to add 3 patients to that city. So we do that there. Then this card gets discarded. We're going to take all the cards in the discard pile for that deck. We're going to shuffle them, and then we're going to put them back on top of that deck. So now we're going to start going through the same cities that we've already been through, which means we're going to get more and more patients showing up in those cities. Now, here's why this is a problem, because there's multiple ways you can lose the game. One way you can lose the game is if you ever needed to add a 4th cube to a city. So let's say here in this city, we already had 3 yellow cubes, and we had to add a 4th cube. Instead of adding that 4th cube, you would add 1 yellow cube to each city that is connected to it, and we would move this tracker here up. This tracks the number of outbreaks we have. If this ever gets to the bottom of the track, you lose the game. If that happens in a city with a hospital, instead of having a normal outbreak, so for example, if this moved in there, instead of having a normal outbreak, you still move this up on the outbreak track, but then the patients in the city basically flee because the hospital's being overrun. So these guys would all move away from the city into the neighboring cities, and then you would move from there. So that's one way you can lose the game. Another way you can lose the game is if you get to the bottom of the player deck and you have not completed your 4 objectives. Then you've run out of time. And then the final way that you could lose the game is if you ever needed to place cubes. So we have a supply of cubes of each color. If you ever need to place cubes of one color on the board and there are not enough left in the supply, then you have also lost the game. Now, I didn't explain what these purification tokens do. Basically, they just let you negate adding a cube of that color to the city. So, for example, if we had to add another cube to Cuenca here, instead of adding another cube, we could just remove one of these purification tokens and not have to add that cube. So that's what those do. That's the basic gist of the game. We'll go back up and I'll give you my thoughts on it. So that's a general overview of how the game is played. One thing I didn't mention that I probably should have is that each of those role cards that the players get, there's 7 of them in the game, and they each give you some kind of special ability, let you do something the other players can't, or just do something more efficiently than other players. Another thing that I didn't show you is that the game comes with 4 cards, one for each color disease, and each of those cards has a special rule about that disease, like how it spreads or how infections for that disease work. And they're adding those cards to the game is optional. It increases the difficulty of the game. And their recommendation is that you, at the beginning of the game, you shuffle those 4 cards and then randomly choose 1, 2, 3, or just use all 4, depending on how difficult you want the game to be. So I think that's a neat mechanism. It's certainly an interesting way to increase the difficulty. That's more interesting than just adding more epidemics to the player deck. So that I think that deserves mentioning. Now, how I feel about the game overall, I like Pandemic. I think it's a well-designed game. I think Pandemic Iberia is good in all the same ways, basically. You have a very straightforward objective you're trying to achieve, but it's that tension between trying to achieve your objective without losing the game in any of the 3 ways that you could lose. That creates an exciting experience and an interesting challenge. And so that's what the base game of Pandemic does, and Pandemic Iberia does it just as well. The things that make this version of Pandemic different from the base Pandemic are basically building railroads, putting down those purification tokens, the way that ports work, and some of the specific abilities of the characters. Also the way that the patients move towards the hospitals after you've built them, and those optional rules with the diseases. Out of all of those, I think that the most interesting one is the railroads. It's kind of neat how in the beginning of the game you feel a little more restricted in how easily you can move across the board. But as you play, you sort of build up this infrastructure that allows you to eventually move very quickly across the board, and that's kind of a neat experience. I also like those cards that I didn't show you that give those special rules to the different diseases. I think that's a really neat innovation. Now, that being said, I feel like a little bit split on this because I feel like all of the new mechanisms that this version of Pandemic introduces could have probably been packaged in an expansion for the original game. So I feel like if you have the original Pandemic and you enjoy it, it would be nice to just buy an expansion for that and get these new mechanisms. On the other hand, if you enjoy Pandemic, or the idea of Pandemic sounds interesting to you, but you don't own the original game, then you can buy this and you get basically the original game, all the good stuff that's in the original game, plus some additional material that's almost equivalent to having an expansion packaged in with the core game. So that's kind of neat. It depends on how you look at it and what your circumstances are, if you already own the original game or not. But that's kind of, I think that's where that's going to depend on you and your preferences and circumstances as to what you own, and whether or not it's a cool thing that you're getting an expansion along with a base game, or if you would just rather be able to buy the expansion material. Now, I will say this is probably a little more challenging. It feels a little more challenging than the base Pandemic, so take that into account as well. I feel like overall, the new stuff that they add just makes the game more challenging. The role cards that come in this, their abilities don't seem as strong as the roles in the original Pandemic. So all of that, I think, comes together to create a more challenging experience, which perhaps you are a veteran of Pandemic and what you want is a more challenging experience, in which case this would be right up your alley. Comparing this to other variants of Pandemic, one thing that stands out to me is that this is the only variant of Pandemic that so far that uses the original theme of fighting diseases. So they put it in a different location, a different time period, but it's still essentially the same theme. Whereas other variants have changed the theme to controlling floodwaters, controlling invading barbarians during the fall of Rome, things like that. So that could be good for you, or it could be bad. Perhaps you really like that theme, and so this will be right up your alley. Or perhaps you're familiar with regular Pandemic and you're looking for something really different, in which case those other variants do a much more extensive job of taking the core mechanisms of Pandemic and really wrapping a completely different theme around it and switching things up. So again, that's going to be personal preference, whether you want something that is more familiar or you want something really different. But overall, I guess my overall impression is that this is a really good cooperative game. It can be very challenging. There's lots of opportunities to work together, strategize as a team, and it's very satisfying when you put together a plan and everything comes together and you save the day. Those are my thoughts on Pandemic Iberia. This has been Nathan with Nice at Dice. Thank you for watching, and you enjoy the rest of your day.